They told him he was digging his own grave. They laughed. They warned him. They walked away. But when winter came, the kind that erases roads, homes, and people, only one place stayed warm. This is not a story about gold or luck. It's a story about a man who chose the earth when the world turned deadly. Watch till the end. Subscribe and leave a like. The land had never been kind, but it had been honest. Elijah Whitford understood that much as he stood at the edge of his claim, looking up at the low, rocky hillside that rose behind the cabin. Montana Territory, 1887. The air carried the sharp bite of early autumn, the kind that slipped under clothing and stayed there, a quiet warning of what was coming. Winter always announced itself long before it arrived. Elijah had learned to listen. The cabin behind him had been built quickly, years ago, when he and his wife still believed speed mattered more than endurance. Rough pine boards, poorly fitted, gaps along the seams where daylight crept through even at noon. When the wind blew from the mountains, the walls shuddered and whined like an animal in pain. Last winter, Elijah had burned the table first, then the chairs. By February, only the bed frame remained, and even that had been split for kindling when the cold grew mean enough to steal breath from his lungs while he slept. His wife, Mary, had not survived that winter. The fever came first, slow and quiet, followed by a coughing that never seemed to end. Elijah had wrapped her in every blanket they owned, pressed his own warmth against her, prayed over her until the words lost their shape. She died 2 days before the thaw. By the time the ground softened enough to bury her, Elijah already knew something inside him had hardened permanently. The neighbors offered help at first. Food, kind words, the practical sympathy of people who had learned to keep grief brief. By spring, they had moved on. Crops needed planting. Fences needed mending. A widower on a bad piece of land was a sad story, but it wasn't a useful one. Elijah could have left. Everyone said so. He could have sold the claim for almost nothing and gone east, found work in a town where walls were thick and winters were someone else's problem. That was what sensible men did. But Elijah had never been especially good at being sensible. He had grown up underground, in the coal seams of Pennsylvania, where his father taught him how to read stone the way other men read faces. He knew how earth behaved when you cut into it. He knew its patience, its memory. Above ground, everything changed too fast. Below, things stayed the same. He set his tools down at the base of the hill. A pickaxe with a worn handle, a shovel patched twice with wire, a pry bar salvaged from an old rail spur. He tested the slope with his boot, feeling the give of the soil. Not loose, not dangerous. Good drainage. Clay beneath the top layer, if his eye was still honest. The kind of ground that held together when asked. "Digging for ghosts now," came a voice from behind him. Elijah turned to see Nathan Caldwell sitting tall in his saddle, reins loose in one hand. Caldwell owned the nearest ranch, 3 miles west, and considered that distance close enough to comment on other people's decisions. "There's no ore in that hill," Caldwell continued, glancing at the slope. "Prospectors tried it years back. Nothing but rock and dirt." "I'm not looking for ore," Elijah said. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you looking for?" Elijah gripped the pickaxe and faced the hillside again. "A place the winter can't reach." The rancher laughed, not unkindly, but loud enough to carry. "You already have a house, Eli. 4 walls, a roof, more than some." Elijah paused, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. He did not turn around. "Walls that breathe wind aren't walls," he said. "And a roof that lets snow pile inside isn't much of a roof." Caldwell shifted in the saddle. People live above ground for a reason. People freeze above ground for reasons, too. Silence followed. Then Caldwell shook his head, the way men did when they decided a conversation was finished. "Suit yourself. Just don't expect anyone to come digging you out when that hill collapses." He rode off without waiting for an answer. Elijah waited until the sound of hooves faded before lifting the pickaxe. The first strike rang sharp, metal against stone just beneath the surface. He adjusted his angle and struck again. Dirt fell away in stubborn clumps. Roots resisted, stretching before snapping loose. The work demanded attention. Pain followed quickly, blooming in his shoulders, settling into his lower back. He welcomed it. Pain meant movement. Movement meant he was still here. By the end of the first day, he had opened a shallow cut into the hillside, no more than a few feet deep, enough to see the layers. Topsoil gave way to dense clay, smooth and dark, holding its shape even when carved. Elijah ran his fingers along the exposed wall and felt a quiet relief settle over him. This would work. The second day brought visitors. Martha Reed rode by with her husband, slowing just long enough to shake her head. "Spring melt will flood that hole," she called out. "You'll drown in your sleep." "Earth isn't meant to hang over empty space," her husband added. "It'll cave in." Elijah nodded, thanked them for their concern, and kept digging. By the end of the week, the cut had deepened into something more deliberate. A narrow opening, just wide enough for his shoulders, angled slightly upward as it moved inward. He worked until his hands blistered, then wrapped them in cloth and worked some more. At night, he returned to the cabin, colder than ever, but carrying with him the strange comfort of knowing the hill was waiting. He dreamed of Mary only once that week. She stood at the mouth of the tunnel, her face calm, her eyes steady. She did not speak. She did not need to. On the seventh day, as the sun dipped low and the wind picked up from the north, Elijah stepped back and looked at what he had started. It wasn't a home. Not yet. But it was a promise cut into the earth, a refusal to lie down and wait for the cold to finish what grief had started. He set the tools carefully aside and rested his hand against the cool clay wall, feeling its solid, patient strength. Winter was coming. This time, he intended to be ready. The work changed him before it changed the hill. Each morning, Elijah woke with muscles stiff and burning, his hands swollen and cracked, despite the rags he wrapped around them at night. The pain followed him like a shadow, but it no longer surprised him. Pain was predictable. Pain could be worked through. What frightened him were the things you couldn't see coming, the sudden storms, the silent fevers, the way winter crept into a house while you slept and decided who would wake up. By the second week, the topsoil was gone entirely. Roots no longer clawed at his shovel. The clay beneath was dense and obedient, cutting clean under the pickaxe, holding its shape instead of collapsing inward. Elijah worked slowly now, deliberately, listening to the sound of the tool striking earth. In the mines back east, men learned to hear danger before they saw it. A hollow thud meant weakness. A sharp crack meant tension. The clay answered him with a steady, dull resistance that told him it could be trusted if he respected it. He kept the entrance narrow, just wide enough to pass through sideways if he had to. The tunnel angled upward from the outside, a small but crucial detail. Water always followed gravity, and Elijah intended to give it somewhere else to go. He measured constantly, checking his lines by lantern light when the day faded too early. When his arms grew too weak to swing the pickaxe accurately, he stopped. Mistakes underground were never small. The neighbors continued to pass by. Some slowed. Some stopped. Their comments blended together after a while. All variations of the same certainty that this would end badly. One young ranch hand claimed his father had hit solid granite, digging a well at 8 feet, and given up after breaking 2 tools. Another predicted Elijah would suffocate before winter even arrived. Elijah listened to all of it, nodded, thanked them, and returned to his work. He had learned long ago that most advice came from people who had never tested their own limits. At night, he lay on the cabin floor, staring at the warped ceiling boards, listening to the wind probe for weaknesses. He thought of Mary in fragments, the way she used to hum while kneading bread, the way her hand felt in his, lighter than he expected, even before she fell ill. Grief came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes sudden enough to knock the breath from him. When it grew too heavy, he reminded himself why he was digging, not to forget her. Never that. But to survive long enough to remember her without freezing to death. By the middle of the second week, he widened the tunnel into the beginnings of a chamber. The space opened gradually, the ceiling rising inch by inch, the walls curving into an oval that distributed weight instead of fighting it. He worked on his knees at first, then crouched, and finally stood, stretching carefully as his head cleared the ceiling. The air inside felt different. Still. Quiet. When he stepped back outside, the wind struck him with sudden force, as if offended by the comparison. Shoring came next. Elijah hauled pine logs from the edge of the property, cutting them to length with careful precision. He placed vertical posts every few feet along the walls, seating them firmly into notches carved into the clay. Across the ceiling, he fitted horizontal beams, locking them into place with measured blows from a mallet. Each piece had to be exact. Too short, and it carried nothing. Too long, and it shifted weight where it didn't belong. He learned to measure twice, sometimes 3 times, before cutting. He learned the sound of wood under proper load, the quiet creak that meant it was doing its job, and the sharp complaint that warned of failure. He made mistakes. One ceiling beam split along a hidden flaw, dropping suddenly before the neighboring supports caught it. The sound froze him in place, his heart pounding hard enough to hurt. For a long moment, he did nothing but listen, waiting for the earth to decide whether to forgive him. When it held, he replaced the beam immediately, working until his hands shook and his vision blurred. Underground, there were no second chances worth gambling on. Between the logs, he packed clay mixed with straw, kneading it by hand until it reached the right consistency. He remembered reading about the technique years ago, an old book passed between miners, describing how ancient builders strengthened earth walls. As it dried, the mixture hardened into a surface nearly as solid as brick, sealing gaps and adding stability. The chamber began to feel intentional, less like a hole and more like a structure that belonged there. By the third week, the temperature inside the chamber barely changed from morning to night. Outside, frost coated the ground at dawn and lingered longer each day. Inside, the air remained steady, cool but not cold, carrying the faint, clean smell of earth instead of rot or damp. Elijah stood in the center of the space one evening, lantern raised, and felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Hope, cautious and fragile, but real. The comments from the road grew quieter as October deepened. People still watched, but fewer laughed. A calf froze overnight on Caldwell's ranch during an early cold snap. Martha Reed's root cellar flooded when the first snow melted too quickly, spoiling half her stores. Small failures, early warnings that the season was turning cruel ahead of schedule. Elijah noticed these things without comment. He had no interest in being right. He only wanted to be alive. He began planning the fireplace, marking the back wall where the stone would sit, measuring the angle for the chimney that would rise through the hillside and emerge higher up the slope. Smoke needed encouragement to travel upward underground, and rain needed discouragement from following it back down. The design formed clearly in his mind, borrowed from half-remembered mine shafts and long nights listening to older men talk about what worked and what killed you. When he finally left the chamber each night, crawling back out into the cold air, Elijah felt the difference immediately. The wind no longer seemed like an enemy he couldn't fight, only a reminder of why he was fighting at all. He sealed the entrance temporarily with boards and canvas, not to keep anything out yet, but to mark the boundary between what he had built and what he was leaving behind. Winter hadn't arrived, not fully, but it was close enough now that Elijah could feel it watching, waiting. And for the first time since Mary died, he believed he might be ready when it came. Winter did not arrive gently. It came early, and it came angry, tearing across the valley with a force that felt personal. By the first week of November, snow no longer melted between storms. It packed itself into drifts along fences and against doorways, sealing the land into hard, white shapes. Elijah had already moved most of his supplies underground by then, firewood stacked neatly along one wall, dried beans, flour, salted meat stored on rough shelves he had built into the clay. A small table, a cot frame waiting for a mattress he planned to finish later. The fireplace stood complete against the back wall, stone fitted tight, the chimney angled carefully through the hillside until it surfaced far above the entrance. When he lit the first fire, the smoke rose clean and steady, drawn upward exactly as he had intended. By late December, the cabin above ground was nothing more than a storage shed. Elijah slept below now, the earth wrapped around him like a held breath. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees and over the roof of the old house. But inside the shelter, the sound softened, reduced to a distant pressure, as if the storm were pounding on a door it could not open. The temperature held steady, cool, but survivable. When Elijah stepped outside to check his traps or bring in more wood, the cold struck him like a physical blow. When he returned underground, warmth met him halfway, patient and unmoving. On January 7th, the sky changed color. It went flat and pale, the kind of gray that swallowed distance. The air grew strangely still, the birds gone, the usual warning signs of weather erased instead of sharpened. Elijah had seen that sky once before, years ago in the mines, when a collapse had followed hours later. He sealed the door from the inside, braced it with a beam, and fed the fire. By nightfall, the wind arrived. It howled without pause, a sound so constant it lost rhythm, like a freight train that never passed. Snow hammered against the hillside, filling every hollow, piling up with a speed that made time meaningless. The thermometer outside the entrance dropped steadily, sinking past numbers Elijah had never seen in Montana. 40 below, by his estimate. Cold deep enough to kill a man in minutes if he stopped moving. Underground, Elijah experienced the storm as pressure and sound. The shelter held. The fire burned. He sat with his back against the clay wall, listening, counting heartbeats, feeling the earth absorb the violence meant for him. He ate sparingly, drank carefully, and waited. The first knock came sometime during the second night. At first he thought it was part of the storm, another trick of sound, carried through packed snow. Then it came again, heavier this time, followed by a muffled voice barely audible through the oak door. Elijah reached for the rifle without thinking, his pulse sharp and sudden. He approached the entrance slowly, lantern raised. "Please," the voice said, thin and broken. "Please. We saw the smoke." Elijah unbarred the door and pulled it open just enough to see. 3 shapes collapsed inward, dragged by the wind as much as by their own failing strength. A man and a woman, their faces so caked in ice they barely looked human, and between them, a child, limp and terrifyingly still. The cold surged inside instantly, clawing at the warmth he had built. Elijah slammed the door shut behind them and threw the beam back into place. "Fire," he said, though they couldn't answer. He dragged them closer to the hearth, stripped frozen coats and boots with hands that shook despite his focus. The child whimpered faintly as warmth reached her skin, and Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Alive. All three alive. It took hours before they could speak. Their names, when they managed them, were Thomas and Ruth Miller, and the girl was their daughter, Grace. Their house, 4 miles north, had lost its roof to the wind. The walls followed soon after. They had run with no direction, following the only sign of life they could see in the white chaos above them. The smoke from Elijah's chimney. They were not the last. By morning, another figure arrived, half crawling, half carried by instinct alone. A young ranch hand named Caleb, separated from a search party, and lost when the wind erased all landmarks. Later that day, an older man stumbled in, fingers blackened with frostbite. His name, Jonah Price, a prospector who had survived too many winters by luck alone and was nearly out of it now. Elijah took them all in, though the shelter had never been meant for more than one man. They slept in shifts, bodies pressed close for shared warmth. The fire burned constantly, fed carefully to conserve wood. Food was rationed without complaint. Fear moved through the chamber like another presence, thick and quiet, but it did not rule them. The earth held. The walls did not move. The storm screamed above them for 2 days and 2 nights, then a third, relentless and unforgiving. Elijah watched Grace as she slept near the fire, her small chest rising and falling steadily now. He thought of Mary in those moments, wondered what she would have said if she could see this place, these people alive because he had refused to listen when the world told him to stop digging. He felt no triumph, only a heavy, grateful exhaustion. When the wind finally began to weaken, it did so slowly, like an animal retreating without admitting defeat. On the morning of the 10th, Elijah opened the door and looked out at a landscape remade. Snow drifts towered higher than fences. Trees bent or snapped under the weight. The sky above was impossibly blue, calm to the point of insult. One by one, they stepped outside, squinting against the light. Silence stretched across the valley, broken only by the distant creak of settling ice. It was over. The storm that had come to kill them all had failed here, and every one of them knew exactly why. The silence after the storm felt unnatural. Elijah stood at the entrance of the shelter and listened, waiting for the wind to return, for the earth to shudder, for something to prove that the worst was not yet finished. Nothing came. The blizzard had spent itself and moved on, leaving behind a landscape that looked less like land and more like a frozen memory of one. The others emerged slowly, as if afraid the world above might still be dangerous. Thomas Miller stepped out first, his movements stiff, his face drawn and hollow. Ruth followed, holding Grace close despite the child's protests that she could walk on her own. Caleb shielded his eyes with one hand, blinking hard at the brightness. Jonah Price took the longest, leaning heavily on the doorframe, his breath shallow but steady. They stood together in the cold, looking out at what remained. Houses were gone, not damaged, not broken, but erased, pressed flat beneath walls of snow and ice. Fences disappeared entirely, their lines swallowed by drifts that reached higher than a man's head. Cattle lay frozen where they had stood, dark shapes against the white. The valley looked vast and empty, stripped of anything that suggested people had ever believed they could tame it. "How did anyone survive this?" Ruth whispered. Elijah did not answer. He already knew that many hadn't. Over the following days, as the temperature climbed just enough to make movement possible, the truth revealed itself piece by piece. Bodies were found in drifts, sometimes close enough to shelter that they might have made it if the storm had hesitated for only a few more minutes. Families were discovered inside collapsed houses, huddled together in rooms that had never stood a chance. The number of dead grew with each search party, with each path cleared. The valley would never quite forget that winter. Word spread quickly about the shelter in the hillside, about the man who had dug into the earth, while others laughed. People came first to see it, then to understand it. Some brought food. Some brought firewood. Some brought nothing but questions and the kind of gratitude that made men uncomfortable because it could not be repaid easily. Elijah answered what he could. He showed them the angled entrance that kept water out, the way the walls curved to carry weight instead of fighting it. He explained the chimney, the steady temperature, the reason the fire never smoked the chamber full. He spoke plainly, without pride, because this had never been about being right. It had been about being ready. By spring, the valley looked different, scarred, but alive. New structures appeared, not above ground, but set into hillsides, half hidden, cautious. People who had once sworn they would never live like animals now worked with shovels and saws, learning where to cut and where to leave the earth alone. Elijah helped when he was asked. He corrected mistakes. He warned against shortcuts. He never charged for the knowledge. Survival, he believed, was not something you sold. Nathan Caldwell came by one evening as the snow finally retreated from the lower slopes. He dismounted without speaking and stood beside Elijah, looking at the shelter entrance, at the smoke rising thin and steady from the hillside. "I was wrong," Caldwell said at last. Elijah nodded. "A lot of people were." "You could have left," Caldwell continued. "Could have saved yourself, and no one would have blamed you." Elijah watched the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the snow in gold and shadow. "Then I would have survived," he said, "but I wouldn't have lived with it." Caldwell had no answer for that. Years passed. The shelter remained. Elijah aged quietly, his hair graying, his hands growing slower, but no less sure. The underground home expanded a little, improved here and there, but never lost the simplicity that had saved lives. Winters still came hard, but they no longer came as surprises. The valley had learned. Elijah died in his sleep one winter night, warm and unafraid, the fire reduced to glowing coals beside him. He was buried on the hillside above the shelter, where the chimney rose and the smoke had once guided lost people home. The grave marker was plain, just his name and the years he had lived. Long after, people still came to see the place. Guides told the story in practical terms, explaining soil and structure, heat and stone. But the part that stayed with visitors was simpler. A man lost everything and refused to surrender to it. He listened to the earth when the world told him he was foolish. He kept digging. And when the storm came, the kind that ends stories instead of beginning them, he was ready. He was alive. And because of that, others were too. Some people run when the world breaks. Others dig deeper and build something that lasts. If this story moved you, write in the comments where you're watching from. Your place matters. Your story matters. Subscribe for more true survival stories and leave a like to support the channel.